When investigators played back the cockpit voice recording, what they heard was a string of alarming revelations leading up to the crash of Flight 222. The recording revealed that the first officer had been rattling through the landing checklist at a breakneck pace, rattling it off as if reciting lines from memory. Standard procedure requires pilots to call out each item individually and cross-check every action on the checklist. Instead, the first officer was going through the motions, and the captain didn't seem to care in the slightest. That checklist represents decades of hard-won safety lessons, paid for in lives, and yet the crew openly disregarded all of it, putting every passenger on board at serious risk. 2 minutes before the crash, the first officer explicitly called out that the airport's minimum descent altitude was 300 feet. The captain ignored him. He kept the plane in manual control and descended illegally to 200 feet. And when the captain asked the first officer whether he could see the runway, the first officer said no, twice, clearly and firmly. Even then, the captain had no intention of executing a go-around. Instead, he kept pushing the plane lower, hunting for the runway. With just 70 feet of altitude remaining, both men were still craning their necks, desperately scanning for it. Another 13 agonizing seconds passed before either of them finally realized something was terribly wrong. They scrambled to throttle up and go around, but by that point, the aircraft had already covered several thousand feet of ground. Both men pulled with everything they had to bring the nose up. It was too late. What baffled investigators was why the crew had taken so long to react. To find answers, they went back to the earlier portions of the recording, and what they heard stunned everyone in the room.
Sir, do we preset next altitude 340 or 400?
Huh?
The first officer, it turned out, didn't even have a clear grasp of the most basic procedures, and the recording that followed revealed why the captain had been so sluggish.
I'm so tired.
Audible throughout was the sound of him yawning and repeatedly. Flying while fatigue severely impairs a pilot's ability to make quick decisions and respond effectively to emergencies. Investigators then pulled the flight logs for both crew members, and what they found was staggering. Over the previous 3 months, this crew had been flying an extraordinarily heavy schedule, averaging 6 flights a day, with shifts stretching beyond 12 hours. Given that kind of punishing workload, it was no surprise the captain had complained about how exhausted he was. Just as the investigation was nearing its conclusion, investigators received another shocking piece of news.
What? Again?
On February 4th, 2015, just 7 months later, TransAsia Flight 235 departed Taipei Songshan Airport, plunged into a river only 3 minutes after takeoff. 43 people were killed. With 2 major crashes in the span of 7 months, investigators had serious reason to believe something was fundamentally broken within the airline itself. A deep dive into TransAsia's corporate background confirmed their suspicions. The airline had been expanding aggressively while cutting costs, and one of the corners they cut was hiring. Rather than bringing on more pilots to meet the growing demand, they simply piled more flights onto the ones they already had. Some pilots were flying 8 flights a day. Employees had raised complaints with management, but leadership brushed them aside. Left with no other option, the pilots kept showing up and grinding through it just to keep food on the table. Investigators wanted to know just how pervasive the disregard for standard operating procedures really was across the airline. They ordered TransAsia pilots to fly simulator runs, adding a typhoon scenario as an extra stress test. The results were jaw-dropping. Not a single pilot at the airline followed proper operating procedures. Not one. With that, investigators finally had a complete picture of what brought down Flight 222. TransAsia's relentless focus on profit, combined with lax regulatory oversight, had set the stage for disaster. On the day of the crash, an exhausted captain took the controls and, in conditions of severely limited visibility, violated the minimum descent altitude in search of a runway he was convinced would appear ahead of him. What he didn't know was that the typhoon had already pushed the aircraft off course. Meanwhile, the first officer failed in his duty to monitor the situation, never challenging the captain or calling for a go-around, even as the plane dropped well below the minimum safe altitude. Both men likely just wanted to get on the ground as quickly as possible. That shared assumption cost 48 people their lives. After a grueling 18-month investigation, Taiwan's Aviation Safety Council released its final report. It concluded that the crew's failure to follow standard operating procedures during the landing approach was the primary cause of the accident, and issued multiple safety recommendations to TransAsia, demanding sweeping management reforms. But by the time the report was published in January 2016, no longer mattered for the airline. 2 disasters in rapid succession had shattered TransAsia's reputation. Passenger numbers collapsed by 70%. Over 3 quarters, the airline hemorrhaged nearly 500 million yuan. By the end of 2016, TransAsia Airways had officially ceased operations. We pause to mourn the passengers and crew members who lost their lives, our fellow human beings who never made it home.